Welcome back. I hope everybody had a good break. So as we have done the last several council rounds, we wanted to set some time on the agenda just for an open discussion on a timely topic with council to really have some transparent but open exchange of information and ideas. And since we're getting into the meat and substance of our strategic planning effort, we thought that this would be a good opportunity to engage with council on the strategic planning effort that we're just initiating. So we invited Sheila Newton from our scope office. I won't try to remember the acronym it's on the slide. To lead today's discussion. So Sheila, podium is yours.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Is that too loud? Am I too close? Yes, I'm Sheila Newton. I'm the Deputy Director of Scope, and I've been the planning officer, the lead for strategic planning for the Institute for many years. And so I'm really excited that we are now fully in our input phase. I mean, strategic planning goes in phases so that you've got, the place where you get all the ideas on the table, and then you get the discussion, and then you get the analysis, and then you get the forming into goals, and then you get the rolling out, and then you get the final bits of input, and then you get your final rollout and product. And but here we are at the start of the process. And it's really kind of nice to have this opportunity because we've just had a couple of days of really excellent presentations and discussion that really cover a big landscape of the things that we do, from toxicology and gene by environment that we just had, and some of the earlier stuff, the microbiome and some of the other stuff from yesterday, and then also all the way up to human populations and the science policy issues that surround them that we also talked about this afternoon. So all of that those are all things that, are at the sort of forefront of our mind, but we also have the opportunity to bring all of those ideas and other ideas that have grown out of, since everything that we talked about has grown out of our current strategic plan. This is the opportunity where we start to sort of look at where we are, morph into what's going to be happening in the next 5 years, try to think about. And so I wanted to open a space, so to speak, for us to, sort of pull ourselves forward and sort of see where, as the mountains that we're climbing now, what's the next peak? What's the next horizon? And so I'll just start here. I've mentioned this is our input phase. And I do want to remind everybody that we have an RFI, an online input tool that for comments to be apart from our discussion today. We have the opportunity for everybody to submit comments on this online tool. And I will say that this is our current strategic plan, and our current plan, our input tool is basically organized along the lines of our current plan. So you can step through comment boxes that are each associated with each of the current goals and provide comments unique or responsive to that goal, looking ahead to the future. Or you can put in a general comment about, this is entirely missing from our previous strategic plan, and you need to make sure that you talk about it in the next one. Whatever it is that the responder wants to say. That's the landing page where the online tool exists. And if you Google strategic plan, it'll go to our current page, but there is a 2024 link on that page. And if you go to the 2024 strategic plan, it will take you to the place where the input tool button exists. And it is open through April 20th. And as all of our council members know, we are also, we have just gotten the invitations out for our virtual open space technology meeting, which will be in mid-April. And if there are any council members who have not yet received their invitation, they should email me right away. And then there will be other inputs as well, because obviously we've been thinking and talking about a lot of these topics over the past several years. And so we don't want to lose sight of reports and recommendations that have come from other workshops that have been held by our different divisions and also by our partners and by the academy and wherever that information can be gleaned. So for today, what I would, sorry.
In case some of the council members didn't participate in the last open space, do you want to take like 30 seconds and just describe the open space and how you moved to
Oh,
it?
yes. Open space is a fabulous thing. And I want to give Rick a lot of credit because in fact, he was the one that turned us on to it back in 2011. And when we did our strategic plan in 2011, that was the first strategic plan under Dr. Birnbaum's tenure. Rick had just come on board as deputy director and he had experience with this wonderful format where you bring everybody together. You bring a group of people together that you think they all have great ideas for whatever it is you want to do. And you have a sequence of events over a couple of days, but you don't have an agenda. You don't have speakers. You don't have anything written down ahead of time except for, you've got ground rules saying, well, all of your ideas need to be relevant to the mission of NAEHS and environmental health sciences. And then you come in and the first thing that happens is you get welcomed and then everybody is sitting in a big circle. We did this one actually in the room where everyone is sitting in a big circle. It's not rows. You're in a big circle and then the facilitator opens the space. And then everyone who has an idea that they think that they want to bring forward for consideration and work it out with other people in the room, comes forward, writes down a little thing about their idea, and then goes to the agenda wall and puts it up on the agenda wall. And that the place where they put it on the agenda wall shows a time and place where there will be a discussion on that idea. The person who proposed it takes the responsibility to lead the discussion and to make sure that there's a short summary that's created. And all of these discussions happen. You have breakout sessions, you have concurrent breakout sessions then for the next couple of days. If you are in a breakout group and you are not either learning something or contributing something, you check right out and you go find another group. It's very fluid, it's very energetic. There's a lot of opportunity for people to really engage and create something. And then you do that for a couple of days with these concurrent breakout sessions. And at the end, you have you take a look at all of the universe of everything that's been put forward and discussed. And then you take that, then the participants go through a couple of exercises to generate, sort of relative importance, relative priority of these things, and also see where they might fit together as, strategic priorities or collected strategic entities. It's a format that generates a lot of engagement and gets great ideas out, gets a lot of input together. I can't say enough great things about it. So, sorry. So what we're doing now, what I wanted to take the opportunity to do right now is to sort of start thinking about, if you're going to be at this meeting in April, what are some of the things that you want to brainstorm, bubble up to the top of your and our thinking, as we get ready to meet in that virtual space. This is going to be done virtually this time. And there are applications that that all of the participants will have access to that replicate the agenda wall and the other things that you do in a regular in-person open space meeting. So some of the questions that were circulated to our council members in advance of the meeting, and I know it was kind of late, but so some of the things, the way this has been framed already, I think, by some of the ways Rick has talked to you about our strategic plan, what do we want to have achieved? What do we want to be known for by the end of the next planning period? And it's also, we're thinking about it as an outgrowth, as a new, what is the next phase of, what is the status and the potential of the things that we're talking about now that are very, they're related, but they're different from the way we were talking about them in 2018. So for example, in 2018, when we wrote this plan, our big thing was about what was the definition of the exposome that we wanted to coalesce around. And obviously from our discussion today and yesterday, we're so far beyond that now. But where is it going? What is the next phase? How are these areas going to evolve in this next time frame? That's sort of where we want to put our brains when we start writing the next plan document. And then also, where are the discontinuities? What are the new opportunities on the horizon that might not appear right now as an evolution, but as a revolution from what's gone before? These are the things I would like to challenge the council members to sort of think about. And if I will open the floor now for whatever, based on what we've talked about today, based on what arises in your mind in response to these questions. Go for it.
So earlier in this meeting, Rick brought up being in front of a community organization that said, okay, enough research, what are you going to do about this problem? And I've just come out of putting in just so far our letter of intent, and I'm about to write the actual application, but the call for applications for the California Climate Action Initiative that just came out required that every project, well, it had a number of requirements, but one of the main ones was that you were going to have something deliverable for, you have to have community partners, and that you will have a deliverable. It's a 2-year grant, so you're going to have the deliverable in 2 years. Around climate and health. And, I think, and it just really forced a lot of us to rethink what scientific question what research can we conduct that will lead to some kind of community action that will actually can move the dial towards the sorts of actions that will actually change the situations. And, at first I thought, well, I'm a researcher, but it didn't take that long before, and looking at some of the documents that, California's strategic planning around climate has already produced to come up with, some of these, some ideas that are of clear relevance, plus talking to, which I did, talking to both community organizations, nonprofits and non-governmental organizations, as well as the medical officers at a number of counties, and lots of ideas percolated up that the research on this would help us with this, and so I don't know exactly how to say that, but basically actionable research that what is the actionable research and how do we identify those areas working with community partners. And I think that, if NAEHS does that in a really systematic way, that that will be an enormous accomplishment. And
I think that's a great idea. And I wanted to, and it fits right into the sort of, the sort of second, what we've been calling about the second theme, the really moving towards translation and how things, so.
Terry Kavanaugh is next in the queue.
Thanks for taking my question. Sheila, I'm glad you're doing this. It's a really wonderful opportunity, I guess, for us to make contributions here. So one of the areas that I think is worth considering. And what's different between the last strategic plan and this one, of course, is we've experienced COVID. And the whole area of DR2 and One Health comes to mind that I think is important for the Institute to think about as a strategic area. And I'm thinking in the context also of the DR2 program, for instance, being able to respond to the disasters and doing it in a way. So the interface that the Institute has with NAID and other institutes that are involved in infectious disease, the potential for environmental agents to modulate immunity, in fact, in wildlife, let's say, or other sources of potential viruses and threats, might be something that we would consider in a kind of more holistic sense for One Health. And that's one area we didn't hear too much about COVID this time around, but last time we heard a lot about it, and time before that as well. I just think in the terms of being prepared for the next epidemic, or maybe even pandemic, it's going to be important, I think, for the agency to position itself in this regard.
And Trevor, you're next in the queue.
Thank you for initiating the conversation today. So one thought that comes to mind for me is looking at where we are now versus where we were with the strategic plan several years ago. And I'd like to think that we can embrace the idea of environmental health for changing times. And under changing times, I would list several thoughts that come to mind. One clearly is climate change and human health, which we've discussed a lot at this council meeting. But the other issue is building on what Terry said about COVID-19. The impact that's had on the health system as a whole in this country has been enormous in terms of people leaving healthcare professions. And as a consequence of that, if you have sickness in your family, to get actually to see a physician now can be a long wait. And this is because we have the wrong emphasis. The emphasis is on treating disease rather than preventing disease. So we have to go back to health wellness to some extent as a consequence of changing time. The other thing is we've heard there's an enormous amount of data out there now. And I think we need to embrace the idea of artificial intelligence and machine learning for a whole variety of environmental health metrics we might be interested in. Predictive toxicology just being one example. And then the technology advances. We've heard a lot about high resolution mass spec, but the other technological advance that's really come to forefront is non-animal models. How can we actually do good toxicology without actually using animals? And how good are animals to use in the first place, right? Are animal models always good surrogate for human effects? So these are the things that I see as part of the changing of times, because these this progress was not evident 4 or 5 years ago.
So if I can follow up on that, because we actually we made a big push in ERA, so 2009, to actually start to begin to develop the microphysiological systems that have now evolved into NAMs. So how do we, how do we see the next thing that can become the next, microphysiological systems? They're not quite ready for prime time to NAMs. They're getting close to being there. So how do we kind of visionarily focus on where's the next one coming, Trevor?
I don't have an immediate answer for you. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't think about it. What we have seen with the microphysiological systems is that there's been an effort from going from a single organ on a chip to having organs in parallel to get at the issue of inter-organ interaction, which is a way forward. I also think things like organoids, and organotypic approaches could also actually get us to where we want to be. There's some good organotypic advances for the brain right now, which would actually speak to doing really wonderful things at the neuroscience level and so on.
Gary, I'll let you finish your note before I call on you. Okay, go ahead, Gary.
So my comment is more about identity of the Institute. We have all sorts of ideas and we can do all sorts of things, but we can't do everything. And one thing that came up in the catalytic workshop was how every institute does genomics in some way. And the National Human Genomics Research Institute focuses on the technologies that all the other institutes use. And is that something that NAEHS should be thinking about? As exposomics has been expanding, how do we make sure everyone's doing it right? And is that a responsibility of the Institute to help maintain that identity? But it kind of takes like a different angle. It's not just about funding R01s, it's more of like an infrastructure thing, but one that could be very useful in getting, I mean, don't we want every institute to be including the environment in their studies? Like, how do we help them do that? But it's different than thinking about like a thematic area. It's more of a, a structural, tactical sort of thing. But I'd love to kind of look into how we could maybe do something like that.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And in fact, we do have, some activity in that space with cheer and, those are some of the ways in which we've tried to take what Rick's trying to do with integrating environment across the NIH and provide the tools to our sister institutes and to people, not just that we fund, but that others fund, in order to make sure that they can bring that capability. And in addition, it's also a strategic plan theme, infrastructure and providing the space and the capacity for the things we want to do.
Like cheer and here, though, it was really more about providing services to other places versus the technologies that they can then take advantage of themselves.
Yes.
So I think Andre is actually next in the queue. Andre, hold on.
Thank you. I would just like to kind of follow up on part of Jason's talk and what I think is highly relevant as far as environmental impacts go, and that's the induction of inflammation. So was obviously a part that Jason didn't get a chance to, but we all know that inflammation is the primary driver of most human diseases. This is my own personal soapbox, but I think it's relevant to really to make sure that we make the connections with how does the environment impact the development of an inflammatory response and all the different organ systems that are impacted. And that's clearly a role that NIEHS can take a leadership. I completely understand that we can't do everything. We have to pick and choose our battles wisely where we can make good investments. But the climate change and the development of inflammatory responses, all these things, I think inflammation can be one of these core elements. That's all I just really want to bring up.
Thank you.
Okay. I will allow it. Irva, go ahead.
Anders, I really appreciate that. And some years back, I remember I was sort of looking at all the diseases that seemed to be rising. This was, back during the early 2000s or mid 2000s or what have you. And it was really striking that, in fact, you think about obesity, diabetes, autism, certain cancers, not all, but, and it seemed to really point to, well, they do all sort of have that in common, although there was it was not obvious to that many people at that point around autism and some of the neurodevelopmental disorders. But at this point now, there's a lot, the maternal immune activation model seems to explain a lot for that area. And, and one of the things, about the immune system is that it's always in response to the environment, right? That system, less so, there is to some extent cardiovascular system or nervous system or what have you, but the immune system really is right there in a constant response mode. And it also really relates to both environmental and social factors and lifestyle factors. So I think it's a nice link, and but that integration across those different areas of insult to well-being is really, it can be a really important, framework for planning, research, and designing studies that, we tend to be very outcome specific, or, at least organ specific, but very much, there's huge work around breast cancer and huge work around Alzheimer's and huge work around, but bringing those together in the ways they are unified, in fact, through some aspects of the physiologic mechanisms, and also through the multiple factors that actually influence those processes. So I had started out just thinking that I would talk about that social, environmental, the confluence, let's say. But the way these things are tied together is really important. The other thing that we've sort of found a bit of evidence in some of our wildfire research is that the mental health symptoms seem to correlate with a bunch of different physical health system symptoms and outcomes. And so these sorts of things that tend to unify around bad health, worsening in multiple ways, maybe fits in with that also, or maybe that's another topic. I don't know. I hope I wasn't too duplicative here.
Lynn, you're next in the queue.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about this a lot on this council, and you've probably thought about it more than I have. But is there a way for the NIH to catalyze real change in what's available to scientists for assessing exposure, just in the way that the NHGRI, I think that's what it's called, did so for genomics, turning it from, a kind of a disconnected set of kind of cottage laboratory things that were slow and were not consistent and were not accessible to most of us, to tools that we can all access. And we're not there anywhere close to there with environmental exposures. And, it probably requires partnerships with industry, but it also, I think, would require what I think happened with genomics. I'm just going to say this, because a lot of people hate me for saying it, but non-directed funding directed just for describing stuff and developing the tools to be able to characterize what the world actually looks like. Before, we're just, because everything that we're doing right now, I think, is around hypothesis testing, with the exception of very few scientists who have been able to actually explore, exposure on a broader basis, Gary being among them. But there just isn't enough of that. And I think it's hard to expect that scientists across many institutes and across many areas will really be able to look at environmental exposures without providing those tools. you know, and that they can feel confident, you know, that what the outputs are, that they can interpret them, that the results are, you know, publishable across different platforms, all of that. And maybe a new NIH director could be interested in such a thing. Who knows? Depends, I guess, on who comes on board, but it would be really kind of a dream of those of us in environmental health to have that.
Well, I'll make sure that it's on the agenda for the new NIH director.
Andrew, I think you're next in the queue.
Yeah, thanks. There are concepts like weathering and embodiment and allostasis or allostatic load that are now around, related things like frailty. These are the cumulative effects of our environmental exposures, or perhaps our gene by environment interactions. I'm really interested in some kind of really getting a better phenotype for vulnerability and understanding vulnerability and tipping points. You know, we think about exposure to our environmental toxicants perhaps leading to overt morbidity, but before that happens, there is likely some kind of a vulnerable state. You know, we have our 2-hit hypotheses. So there's something that has made a community or individuals vulnerable, and I'd like to see some more emphasis on understanding that vulnerable state. And I guess I was really taken with the discussion just earlier about this idea of environmental counselors, you know, that you know, kind of radically applied translational research. And this idea of, you know, understanding vulnerability would be, of course, feeding into what these counselors could understand. But so I guess 2 things. It's understanding vulnerability. And I actually think this idea, I think Gary brought it up, of these environmental counselors, this would be a really interesting area of leadership for NAEHS to lead the development of a new certification program for folks that could be, you know, I think, you know, we've worked with the PACUs, the pediatric environmental health specialty units. We know what the limitations of our clinical physicians are in terms of addressing environmental health. It may be time to put together this parallel specialty, and it would be pretty remarkable if this was a legacy for NIEHS to really push this forward to the STEM and kind of environmental medicine medical community.
The public health community. Yeah,
What's that?
the public health community.
Yes, public.
So Andrew, I'm glad you raised this because I think that this might actually be a nexus for some interesting conversation with council, because you couched it in terms of understanding vulnerability. And is there a role that we could use the strategic plan to change the dialogue from focusing on the vulnerable to focusing on the resilient? And you know, can we, you know, by understanding vulnerability, also be focusing on understanding resilience, and rather than finding ways to address the vulnerable, we find the ways of building resilience in those vulnerable populations.
I agree. And once you go to resilience, you of course go to all levels of other things discussed here, from disaster resilience to recovering from other community trauma and yeah, so agreed.
And Terry, I think you're next in the queue.
Thanks, David. So back to this idea of these environmental counselors. There's a program that was here in Seattle that was fostered by the American Lung Association, the local chapter, called Master Home Environmentalist, where people would get training. These are mostly community members, so it wasn't at a very high level. But the idea would be that many of them were students and interns and so forth that would go out into the community and interface with community members and actually teach them to become master home environmentalists. Now, it was a relatively small program and with limited goals, but I think it was an interesting model and fairly successful in helping people to avoid, essentially, because it was mostly about asthma and other aspects of excuse me, of respiratory health, to modify their exposures and limit their exposures to allergens and to other things that might be exacerbating childhood asthma. Anyway, I really agree that this would be a wonderful thing to be able to do to develop for the Institute, develop training in this area and put some resources towards it.
We have nobody else in the queue. We have time for other people to raise their hand and bring other ideas.
David, can I just make a comment or just ask the group a question? So the environmental health counseling would be counseling for individuals. And it could be factoring in gene environment effects, different environmental exposures, a whole variety of different things. But what about the context of counseling, not to individuals, but to the public health? So about creating public health messages around different environmental exposures. Are we doing a good job of that? And so what does it actually mean? So if we report back, Liam and I were having a private chat back and forth, but you report back research results to individuals. But what about reporting back research results to groups of individuals? And what does it actually mean? I mean, for example, we recently published this a really beautiful piece of epidemiology work on hair straightening products. And so the public health message on that, we got a lot of different feedback coming in from different sectors. So how do we create a public health message? I mean, the science is there. Okay, the science is, and it's terrific science, but creating a public health message to groups of individuals, can we do a better job of that sort of thing? So I don't know, what are thoughts about that?
So Rick, I have a few thoughts about that. I mean, there are people who specialize in that. There are academics who do a lot of research in this area who are really, really knowledgeable about the, there's an enormous variation in how people understand these kinds of environmental messages. And that very much has, intersects with health equity. The more powerful people are, the less concerned they are. People who are more powerless are more concerned. Race, age, gender, there are all kinds of considerations. And there are people who have training programs that attempt to train people to go out and be professional communicators. I've worked for places that hire them. EPA hired them. When I worked for the state of California, we hired them. It's not like genetic counseling though, in that there's not not a licensing board. There's no kind of, official credential, I guess, any more than is there credential to be an epidemiologist? Not really. But there's also, and there does have to be, and I think this is unique, people who are doing that kind of work at a community level need to have some sensitivity to how those messages impact individuals. Because every time you're communicating to the community, you're also talking to a bunch of people who also are, their mothers, their fathers, their children, their patients. They have cancer or they don't, and so there are personal implications often that if you're not sensitive to that, the communications can just be terrible. So I think that, yes, there are people who think about it, there are people who work on it, but it's not a field that has been as probably well developed and matured as it should be. And there are people who could do a really good job, helping the NAEHS develop it. I mean, you could do a workshop or something and bring them in, because I do think there's an opportunity to develop this, and especially if you're moving forward with an increased emphasis on return of research results, which I would argue are never just to individuals, because you're always going to have general environmental measurements, and you're always working with a community, and at the very least, they're going to want to know, where were those people who had those exposures? Where did the exposures come from? You kind of inevitably have an intersection there between what's going on with individuals and the whole public.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I agree. I think that's something where I definitely kind of saw this as an individual to community level sort of, and even more public health. is I just sent a note to my department chair where we have an MPH in environmental health, which there's probably about 50 of these programs across the country, is that there you have a group of people that understand the environmental part, they understand the public health part, and somehow like a certification that could be provided to people who had an MPH already, like you probably have 80% of the training already there. They just have to learn a bit more about the counseling aspects and some other parts of it, but it may not be a big jump. It's more about what is the content. And that's something that the Institute could be very helpful with, saying, what are the competencies that you would need for something like that? But at least with someone who has an MPH in environmental health, they would already have a lot of that competency you would need.
I actually would argue a little bit with that I don't underestimate the skills that are required for counseling and the knowledge that's required, and don't overestimate how much of that we provide with the MPH. I've got a huge MPH, and that's just, we do have an MPH in behavioral sciences that focuses more on that, but our environmental health MPH does some of that, but it doesn't really focus on that. And we're not selecting students on the basis of their counseling skills or counseling abilities. If you made their emotional intelligence, what you want to have when they're out there working directly with people, which is not to say there can't be an intersection. It's just not inevitably true that everybody who learns environmental science can be a counselor. It's not easy to be a counselor.
Right. But I mean, I was thinking this would be like a subset of those people that had that training. But when you think about the community engagement cores that our P30s have, the community part, we have a lot of expertise at our institutions that deal with the community. So like you already have a lot of the scientific and community expertise and the relationships with the community, like to embed for internships and things. So to me, like, I think it's like, yes, there needs to be a lot more, but it would be a very good group to recruit from. If you got 10% of those people that wanted to invest already had, a background note or something, I think it would just be rather than starting from scratch.
I agree with that. And also, what you're doing, forming interdisciplinary teams, that's a great approach. And, the person who knows about human interaction and counseling can kick the other one under the table. I'm just kidding. But I do think that the teamwork can be a way to achieve some of this.
That actually sounds like a very exciting area to pursue. Anybody else want to offer anything?
Trevor.
Hi, Sheila. So thank you very much for this. This has been really cool. I wondered since we only have a few minutes there, if we could I'd be curious to hear from council if there were maybe, one area in the EHS field that they thought was particularly ripe for a breakout in advance, something that would be potentially really field changing that we're not doing now.
I don't know if this is field changing, but I think that there's a lot to learn from the really young folks out there. The high school and college students, undergrads who really think in a different box than most of us do. I'm teaching a course that I set it up to have both undergrads and graduate students both in there. And it's such a dynamic thing that goes on. And even though the young people, they don't know the science, they don't, but they're just so, full of, they'll throw out an idea that you think that's crazy. And then you think a little further and you think, maybe that's really where we should be going. And
I like that. So I don't know, I think that's a really interesting concept. If I could just follow on for a moment, Sheila, as I think many of us know, a number of years ago, HHMI developed a program where they looked to really sort of jumpstart the early career scientists at that point thinking sort of post PhD. So instead of doing a traditional postdoc, you would move directly into an opportunity to engage resources. So Herbert, if one sort of extended that to your idea, perhaps a way of allowing us to tap into undergraduates in a way for essentially idea mining or focusing, I think could be something that's really cool. And again, we're always interested, and we have programs here at NAEHS designed to bring in high school students and undergraduates as part of our summer and other training programs. So we really obviously recognize the value of capturing people at that very young age. And so I think that's a potentially transformative idea. Thank you.
Jan.
First of all, I think the idea of pulling together, let me back up. In response to what Trevor was saying, I'm sure we are going to find that there are some really key scientific ideas that are going to move the field forward. But I do think the thing that is what we've been talking about, and that is communication. And wherever that communication is, but I think it's going to be at all levels. One of the things I was thinking when Liam was speaking was that it would be very useful to have somebody from the AAMC, so the American Association of Medical Colleges, as part of that thought group, to really try to think about how one can begin to incorporate the environment across the different fields of medicine. So, first of all, occupational health can mean a lot of different things to a lot of people, and it isn't always environmental occupational health that people think about. Young people are really way more passionate about the environment than I think, many older people are. And I think it's a real opportunity missed because, again, if we're talking about that personalized environmental health, some of the people that are going to be the recipients of that are, in fact, in the medical field, whether it's assistants, additional caregivers like diabetic nurses or, again, some sort of certification type of program. But I really think that is a place that would be really helpful. The other thing that I think would be really helpful is, in fact, thinking about educating the media. Because they have a tremendous amount of influence in different circles. And again, rather than just picking the traditional media, maybe thinking a little bit more out of the box to more of the social networking kinds of things. So again, a little bit following up on what Lynn was saying about, there's knowledge out there that I think we could tap into to really spread the messages a little bit more effectively.
And Andrej.
Thank you. Referring to the messaging, I think, being full context here that this is where all the different levels of scientists can and should get involved with this, and in part to address Trevor's point is that there really needs to be more integration of incorporating the fundamental biological mechanisms and understanding in environmental health impacts, and to really get that across. We're talking about science, we're talking about science facts, and trying to get people to understand, and this is where it begins, but at a level that's understandable to the lay public on up to our representatives. And I also have to sign off. I apologize.
No worries. Thank you, Andrej. And Terry, I see your hand up. I'm sure you're going to reinforce that message.
I am, and I was struck by an episode of Hidden Brain. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that program on NPR a couple of weeks ago. It was entitled The Snowball Effect. I just looked it up here. It's about how certain memes go viral and what are the social aspects of that, and how it can be used actually to get your message across very effectively, and what are the sort of social constructs that are behind that. It might be something that the Institute actually thinks about investing in, if in fact we want to, as Andre said, get around to the most effective message we can put out there, and the training that's necessary, I guess, to do that, both at the higher levels of people who are, at the senior levels versus, in addition to training young people in getting some of the messages out that we want to put out there for environmental health.
So I think this also raises, so many years ago, I was involved with the Nanomedicine Roadmap Program, which was an effort to develop nanotechnology for therapeutic applications. And kind of a life-changing conversation that we had there was, we were really, the program team was pushing them to get into mechanistic understanding of how are these nanomaterials influencing health and what have you. And one of the engineers said, stop. Let the engineer talk to the clinician. We're both all about solving problems. This understanding is getting in the way. Where is the role for us to really kind of come back to push the importance of fundamental understanding in the connection between exposure and health outcomes? So that kind of embracing Andre's initial point, that understanding that context of how environmental exposure is influencing your health is sometimes more important than understanding you've been exposed to this, therefore you're at risk of that.
Well, if nothing else, that actually brings me to mind about the way Jason opened his talk, where he had a really simplistic observation about one compound did this and the other one didn't do the same thing. And so for a long time, they just missed the effects that the second compound were having. So anyway, I'm all about understanding.
Yeah, David and Sheila, I'm looking at the clock.
Yes.
We're beginning to lose members of council.
Indeed.
So I think we're planning to adjourn at 4. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, then maybe we should move in that direction. So you want to grab that gavel there, and
so somebody came and stole your gavel during the break, I think.
Three claps in the hand is the virtual gavel. And,
right.
It's, I just want to thank everyone. I thought this was a very engaging discussion today. Lots of fabulous presentations, wonderful exchange of information, and I look forward to our next discussion. I see Dr. Archer and actually Dr. Belshaw. Any parting comments that you want to make before we adjourn?
I'll just echo your comments, Rick, that I thought it was a really good couple of days, and look forward to having you engage with us in the strategic planning process going forward. David?
Yeah, again, I think, the last 2 days has been great. I think we've gotten a lot of really valuable input from council, which is exactly what we're looking for. And it was also wonderful to actually be able to do this at least semi in person. And I look forward to trying to do another hybrid meeting again in June. So let's, safe travels to those who are traveling back. And we'll see you we'll probably see you virtually in April at the strategic planning, but we'll definitely see you in June.
Well, just commenting that I'm doing part of this by Zoom, and it was much better being there in person. So hope to see you all at some point. We'll continue to do it hybrid to accommodate people's schedules, but it was great meeting. And Terry, sorry that you'll be leaving us. And thank you for all your valuable comments.
It's been really a great experience and very happy to have participated. So if you need to call me again, let me know.
We know how to reach you.
Okay, great.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.